Hello and welcome to the dark side. We are so happy to be back after our 2-week vacation. We're delighted that you are joining us this evening. Thank you for coming. We hope that you have a great show. We hope that you've had a great restful 2 weeks, and the dark side, you've stepped into the light and seen some color and some vibrancy. But we're here to bring you the alternative, of course. The dark side. We will be discussing today a couple of news stories, some breaking news, 3 news stories, and then we will dig into the main event. The main event is actually about oil companies who are making about $103 trillion in the last few decades alone, and yet telling us that the prices have gone up. I'm sure you will be wanting to watch this episode. So what you will notice is that Mr. Storm will join us eventually, which will be nice. But for now, let's dig into the news. Breaking news today. Finland today have announced that they are set to join NATO, and Sweden therefore announced shortly after that they would also join. This is historic. It is potentially life-changing, of course, because we know that the war in the Ukraine is one of the prompts for this issue. Finland and Sweden have had standing invitations to join, but have thus far, over the 70 or so years that it's been in existence, not joined and have become kind of neutral states, so to speak, almost, not have the status, but have not joined. But with the war in the Ukraine, with the talk of continuing to expand into the former USSR countries, with all of that at play, we find that Finland has decided to okay, we've got two Mr. Storms today. Okay, interesting. We find that they have decided to join. I think one of the challenges that we have here is that this potentially puts them in a collision course. Rightly so. If they are NATO, that puts us all in a collision course. And so there's this tricky tightrope that they've been walking all of this time, and it's become evident that Putin really does want to reunify the USSR. He really does want to have that as his driving force, and at what cost doesn't matter to him. The point is that it will be unified. One of the interesting things I found today is he was like, NATO is an attack on the Russian people. I found that quite interesting, because that's what you're telling your people, except the only place that the bombs are dropping is in Ukraine. It's a bit rude, really, to say that, isn't it? That's just my little take on it. Mr. Storm, anything on the breaking news today?
I gotta confess, I do love saying "I told you so."
We did discuss this before. I think we discussed this on the dark side, haven't we?
Yeah, I said from the beginning, since all this kicked off, that they would join, and that they had the standing invitation.
Yeah.
So I think what we have to understand, and I've said it before, is that Putin is an ideologue, and he is operating under that idea that superpowers should have spheres of influence.
Yep.
And NATO is a threat to Russia, because the whole point of NATO being set up was to combat Russia.
Yeah.
So the fact that he sees it as a threat, understandable, and that the threat is approaching your borders, understandable. That it would make him feel uneasy. But the reality is, whether it's on your borders or not, they haven't actually done anything to constitute an act of aggression or an act of war.
No.
So, yeah, I think the idea of having spheres of influence is an outdated notion that tramples over the ability and the rights of a people to self-determine. So I think that's an erroneous, or not erroneous. It's a misguided notion for people to operate under. And so, as I said, I understand why he feels the way he does, but this reaction is not right. And here's the reality: if you're talking about having an enemy at the border, I'm pretty sure that Russia for weeks was amassing soldiers on the border of Ukraine, telling them we have no intention to attack you.
All of
So if
that, right?
feeling this unease over what is happening with NATO
Yeah.
and countries
Yeah.
on your border joining NATO, perhaps it's only because it betrays your own internal thought processes.
It
Because
betrays the lies that you've told. Yeah.
the only person so far to have amassed an army on the border of a neighboring country and then attacked
Said neighboring country.
is Russia.
Yeah. And that is the reality, folks. Yeah. Yeah.
And look, I think the other thing to bear in mind is what this may actually do is speed up the Russian timetable for attacking Finland and Sweden. I think if they do that, they're going to stretch their forces extremely thin, and it's going to lead to a complete annihilation of the Russian army. I also think that we need to bear in mind, to some degree, Russia has been holding back in Ukraine. As bad as it has been, they have been holding back somewhat. If they decide to attack Sweden and Finland simultaneously, I would expect them to not hold back in their actions in Ukraine anymore because they cannot afford to fight a war on three fronts.
No, it's not possible.
The other thing is that
I mean, it would propel us into a world war, though. That's the problem.
Of course, because
if they sign up to NATO,
yes,
and Russia attacks,
then there's an
NATO
obligation
soil,
by all NATO members to respond, and there's
and
a legal obligation which they cannot renege out of, like they did with Ukraine. They are fully committed under this treaty to respond. So
I guess we all will be watching as the weeks unfold and these contracts are signed and things move forward to see what the response will be. So far, the response has been words, but we shall see. Calm words, actually, which has been quite surprising, but words nevertheless. Well, the next story that we're going to look at are actually the three news stories that we're going to look at. One of them hits on an issue that if you grow up in the UK, particularly within the region of London, I find that you get told this, particularly if you're a young black man. If you have nothing to hide, you should just comply with the police. You get told this all the time. So this is a statement that's made continuously in the UK, particularly in inner city areas, particularly to young black men. Okay, so stop and searches. We've talked about that on this show before. We've talked about all the ways in which the media and popular culture have made this idea that if you have nothing to hide, you just comply with what the authorities want. This story will tell you why it's a one-way street and it's a lie. Sheku Bayo was a man living in Edinburgh. Many years ago, sadly. All right, so he's a 31-year-old trainee gas engineer who died in May 2015 while being held by officers who were responding to a call in Kirkcaldy, Fife. Sorry, wrong area. Kirkcaldy, Fife is where they are. Okay. In this, they immediately head in. Within 50 seconds of them arriving, he was basically dead. They had him pinned down to the ground, tied up, and were choking the life out of him. When paramedics were finally allowed to attend to him, it was obvious that they weren't going to be able to revive him. The family have been fighting ever since in order to get justice for Sheku. What has happened is the police, their watchdog and the Crown Office, are finally now going to have an inquiry into the death of Sheku. The police watchdog have done this. What's interesting is that the lawyers have asserted that there is an unholy trinity of racism, dishonesty, and incompetence. And what I find really interesting is that the three things can never be unlinked. So the the prosecution, the people that are the solicitor, the family solicitor, and Amr Anwar is challenging this idea in court now. And he's basically saying, look, if you keep claiming that racism doesn't exist, what you're relying on when you do these stop and searches is bias. It's not implicit bias, it's absolute bias. It's the criminalization of Black people. It's the racism that's going on, which means that you never fully train your officers. And when they go into these situations, their incompetence at their job, and then the lies they have to tell in order to cover up their incompetence and the racism that underpins the whole thing is going to lead to more incidents. Now, he has challenged because they refuse to give testimony. Surprise, surprise, they don't want to give testimony. So the solicitor has said, if the police have nothing to hide, if they did everything right, why do they not comply with the inquiry? The family have said, and this is what stuck out to me, the family have said, we have been challenging and asking questions, and we have been vilified. Sheku was painted as all kinds of things which are untrue, as violent lies, and all sorts of things were done surrounding this family and the criminalization of this man. He had 24 separate injuries, cuts, lacerations, bruises, broken ribs. I mean, it was awful. His death was absolutely awful. And the family simply say this: if they have nothing to fear from coming and giving a full and frank testimony to the inquiry, why won't you do it? The same thing that you are constantly telling the Black people that you are killing, if you've got nothing to hide, why would you not just comply? Somehow does not manage to apply to them. Somehow, because of course, Mr. Storm, any thoughts on this story before we move on to our next story? I know you had something to say.
You know what? I think I'm just going to mute my mic because whatever comes out of my mouth is perhaps not fit for civilized company.
Yeah, it's a really shocking case. I mean, of course, we understand that in 2020, the world was rocked with the George Floyd, but before there was George Floyd, there was Sheku. He didn't get the coverage, of course. It wasn't filmed and televised around the world, but his death was equally as violent. He was pinned down to the ground by several officers. I mean, the fact that he was covered in 24 different types of injuries, broken bones, the full 9 yards. I mean, the life was literally choked out of this man. And the family have been fighting since 2015. We're in 2022, 7 years. And it's heartbreaking because his body was lifeless. The ambulance was there. Everybody was there to do the rest of the kind of crew were there to do the right thing. And these police officers never allowed him to be seen, never treated him as human. And the process then began. Immediately they did that. They started to smear campaign the family to accuse them of things, and to every time we do these stories, it beggars belief that we have to keep fighting as hard as we do in 2022 to get justice for cases that should have just been checked. The minute you did that, you should have been put on administrative leave. Investigations should have happened. Badges, things, arrests should have been made, point blank. And yet still they're allowed to serve as officers, to continue to tell lies and refuse to participate. Where have we seen that before? Over the last few weeks of the dark side, we have seen case after case where an institution has refused to participate in the investigation to hold them accountable for the actions of violence they enact upon a community, whether that is a community for supporting pro. We've seen that in the case of the lecturer and author who was arrested, whether that is a young person on the receiving end of their violence, or whether it is Sheku who has been killed by the police. It's shocking.
Yeah, look, I think we need to acknowledge that this is always intended to be a whitewash from the beginning, because you have different types of inquiries that take place, and you can be compelled under certain types of inquiry to attend and give testimony. The fact that they can refuse to do so should tell you that this was never about truly getting to answers and the bottom of what happened. If they did, they would have been compelled. They would have set up the type of inquiry that compels people, or has the power to compel people to attend and give testimony.
Yeah, this one is a public inquiry. It's being held at Capitol House in Edinburgh. They are being, I think they are being compelled to attend. The testimony, however, is what the solicitor and the family are challenging, is the fact that they are choosing to stay silent.
Right. Okay.
And
Now that's
that
what
is where the rubber meets the road of these inquiries. If they choose to not incriminate themselves, of course, because effectively you will there is no telling of this story that's not going to incriminate the officers that knelt down on this man and killed him and brutalized him. 50 seconds and he was dead. How did what explanation? He had nothing on him. There was, what explanation could you possibly give to justify that action when he was tied up and already restrained? There is no explanation.
No, there isn't any explanation. And you're right, they cannot compel them to answer, but they can compel them to attend. Look,
it's a horrible situation. We pray.
Yes, a horrible situation. But for me, what is more telling is that, okay, you may not achieve justice for Sheku, but after this incident, there has been no real review and overhaul of policies and procedures to ensure that something like this doesn't happen again. And that lack of action, that lack of intentionality only demonstrates that such things and such actions and such outcomes are intentional.
Yeah. Yeah, sadly. Very sadly. Our next story, I'm going to try and be as sensitive as I can in how I speak, because I know that people will rush to label me one way or another. So I'm going to try my best to speak carefully so that you understand what I'm saying. Journalist Shireen Abu Akel was murdered not too long ago, Wednesday, May 11th, and she was struck by a gunfire along with another journalist during an IDF raid in the city of Jenin. This is located in northern West Bank, Palestine. She was pronounced dead at the hospital, but the wound would have really meant that she had died. She was wearing full body armor, everything, with very clearly labeled that she was a press. This means that her physical safety should have been assured. Not only that, it would have meant she had diplomatic protection as well. At her funeral this week gone past, the shocking scenes that many of us have seen is of people of the Israeli forces beating the crowds, carrying her casket. Not just beating the crowds, but of beating the people who actually were holding her casket. I mean, the scene, it was just awful. You could almost see it tipping as they were being beaten with those batons and everything like that. It was a horrid, horrid scene. I've never seen anything like that. The crime that the people had committed was carrying a Palestinian flag, which is technically illegal. Technically illegal. Okay. And so the excuse that was given is that because some people had a Palestinian flag, it was the police's right to beat the people. It said that during that time, people who were attending the funeral were being asked if they were Christian or Muslim, and Muslims were being barred from entering the funeral of Shireen Abu Akel. This is horrific. There is no way to slice it and dice it. Somebody who should have been protected, a funeral procession at which people are grieving and mourning the loss of a beloved journalist who's worked for more than 30 years in the region and has the respect of most people, shouldn't have her funeral interrupted with the violence of police. But around the world, governments are silent. News media outlets not really sharing the information. It's very difficult to find it. You have to actually look for it because it's not going to be on your general news stations. They reported her killing, but the scenes that were recorded for all to see, somehow the evidence of the violence that's being enacted upon these people as they grieved, just somehow is not making the daily news. It tells me that there's a real corruption that has long been talked about. And as soon as you start on this subject, people are saying, well, you're being anti-Semitic, as the immediate flare up and the backlash, which is why I carefully read you the story. What's infuriating about that is it's a silencing technique. It's a way to stop people speaking, not about somebody's religion or somebody's ethnic origin, but about a political system which enables police to go in, violently kick the crap out of people at a funeral as they are peacefully walking a casket down, and then say it's anti-Semitic to speak about that because you're then talking about an ethnic group. When what you're talking about is politics, and the politics of murdering people and beating people. I'm not anti-Semitic. I don't have a problem with Jewish people or their culture or their religion. I'm a Christian. It comes from Judaism, and I'm very, very, very keen to remind people of that constantly. But what infuriates me is that it is so difficult to talk about this subject without being accused of something, without people coming in and quickly jumping to conclusions. It shouldn't be that we see scenes like that and we go, too difficult to speak about, don't want to get accused of being something. This is really uncomfortable. And as uncomfortable as it is, it needs to be said that that is unacceptable and that there should be conversations, questions held to account for why a journalist is murdered. And instead of investigating the circumstances of her death, you're trying to find ways of abusing the people. That to me is just, it's heartbreaking. And I can't imagine living in that kind of volatile situation constantly and then watching as you're barred from someone's funeral, and those that actually make it to get through are beaten as they're carrying her casket. I can't imagine what her family are going through. That's not something that you would imagine that a family has to go through from a so-called nation that has nothing to hide and is being supported by Western nations. I don't know. Mr. Storm, any ideas, any thoughts, anything you want to say on that issue before we go to our last story before we hit our big one?
Right. First of all, if anyone watches this and wants to call me anti-Semitic, you can go bleep, right? I'm just going to put that out there because here's the reality. That term is weaponized and exclusionary, or it excludes people that it should cover, because these Arabs are also Semitic people. However, when we talk about being anti-Semitic, we all know that people only use it to a particular group of Semitic people, right? So if you actually want to talk about the truth about being anti-Semitic, a lot of the people that we're speaking about that have been abused by the IDF are Semitic people. So if you are not protecting the people that are being abused, the true anti-Semite here is you. Right. With that said, I want to point out the stark differences in response. There was the US citizen who was a journalist that was killed in Ukraine. And immediately the US State Department came out and said that it was a war crime. Okay. Now, you now have the killing of not just a Palestinian, a U.S. Palestinian citizen.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, she was shot and killed. That's it. Well, why wasn't this considered to be a war crime? like the other journalist that was murdered. Oh, is it because she is not white? Is it because of who murdered her? Or is it a combination of the two? And I think we also need to look at the haste at which media outlets spread the disinformation that
Mm-hmm.
was given by the Israeli government.
Yeah.
Because when she died, the first thing they did was accuse the Palestinians of doing it.
Yeah.
Then it was,
Quickly.
then it was, well, we're not sure who did it. And what's definitely not really being reported is that they're now saying, well, maybe we did it and we have to do an investigation.
Yeah, the current news story that I read was that they said maybe it was one of us, but what we're looking for is the Palestinian that did it. That was literally the sentence. I was like, is that really a sentence that you constructed? And said, we're going to investigate because maybe there was foul play. But since we believe it was a Palestinian, we're going to investigate the Palestinians to ensure that it wasn't them. Hold on, wait, what? Surely it would be easier to start at home. I'm just saying, if you think it was you in the first place, if that's the accusation, start there first. How about that?
And just on another note, I am curious as to why the U.S. has not invaded Israel in the pursuit of democracy and freedom of speech. Because carrying a flag in the US is regarded as freedom of speech.
Right. Now, listen, this flag issue really irritated me because I think of the violence enacted upon Black people in the South with the Confederate flag, right? Which is not the US flag. And yet, still, we can look across the waters to somebody else who's deemed it a crime to carry a flag, which would be freedom of speech, would be covered under all of that. And everyone goes, well, then maybe they deserve to be beaten because they were technically breaking the law. What now? Because in the US, if we started to beat people who had the Confederate flag, what would happen? What are we saying? In the UK, they've had flags flown for the what is that group?
EDL.
Yes, EDL. There you go. Wasn't the first one I was looking for. There's been so many, but they've what we're allowed to beat them now. Is that what you're saying? It's not the national flag, so we're allowed to beat them. Like what? That's like a thing. People who use that as a justification, I just somebody had a flag, so it's within our rights to beat them. Okay, I see how your children are living. Wouldn't want to like we need to investigate your household because if just an infraction of a flag is going to cause you to justify violence to another human, we probably want to have a conversation about how you run your household. And that's not gonna work.
Well, see, and I think that's the problem in that often the abused are not viewed as human.
Yeah.
And I think that's a conversation that we really need to have. Look, the whole Israel Palestine political situation is a mess, right? And there are historical reasons as to why it's a mess, largely to do with the UK and the US, um, and the racism of the US and the UK when you look at their policy decisions regarding that region of the world. What is the answer moving forward? Listen, I really don't care if they go for a one state or two state solution. I really
Has to
don't
be a
care.
solution. You can't keep killing people like this. You can't keep beating people like this.
Right. You know, the real problem is, and I think that needs to be addressed, that is why the situation will never be resolved, is because whether you go for a one party or, sorry, a one state or two state solution, you need to talk about reparations. and those that hold the power are not willing to do that. So there will never be a resolution to this problem. That's the long and short of it.
Well, I pray otherwise, which brings us to our next story of there'll never be a resolution to this problem. On Saturday, yesterday, Buffalo saw the worst mass shooting in the US so far this year, 2022. Okay. I was quite stunned because we are in May before we got the worst one this year. Normally these hit a lot earlier. 40,000 deaths a year in the US from firearms, including suicides. So, this is a wide-ranging number of deaths that occur. 40,000 per year. It's an insane number. Meanwhile, hate crimes reached a 12-year high. I had to ask a question which I've not been able to find the answer for, which is when did they start recording this? Because this statistic made me just kind of gulp. So meanwhile, hate crimes in the US have hit a 12-year high in 2020, with over 10,000 people reporting offenses related to their sex, gender, sexuality, and disability. They clearly missed at least 450 years of complaints, because I was like, that 10,000 was the high. Amazing. Crimes against Asian and Black Americans in particular surged that year. FBI figures suggest that although police are not mandated to submit hate crimes, so that means that the number is higher, those that to the FBI, those numbers are thought to likely be undercounted anyway. So that's quite shocking. But what had happened is an 18-year-old white man pulled out a gun and began shooting spree in a supermarket in a majority Black area of Buffalo. He shot 13 people. 11 were Black, 10 are dead. It's a predominantly Black neighborhood. He went into a supermarket and he was shooting people outside on the way. And of course, we've all seen the images that he was gently lifted and placed into a car. It wasn't even lifted, gently guided. And, he was left unharmed. Nothing had happened to him. Yet he had an AR-15, I believe it's what it's called. And he had a number of weapons, and he was in the middle of a shooting spree. But somehow they managed to talk him down and arrest him calmly. The question many have asked is, where did they stop to get him takeaway? We don't know any of those stories. But again, the horrific nature of the crime speaks for itself. What I found interesting is the community's response was, he's only 18. Who did this to him? He's barely an adult. Like, who filled this child with so much hate that he went on the rampage? And within minutes of that question being answered, Fox News presenter Tucker Carlson, just all of his clips of the hate-filled rages that he has posted. And that's just mainstream media. Of course, we're not even talking about the subcultures that particularly prey on white boys to further this white supremacist idea that gives them the idea that they can walk into Black neighborhoods and shoot people indiscriminately, killing church leaders, staff workers, customers, in such a horrific, violent manner, and then get away with it. This is another story of a shocking incident of this type of violence that continues to be prevalent within US society. And yet still, people will then say it's too soon to talk about gun reform. It's not about guns, and it's not about that. Well, no, it's about white supremacy. You're absolutely correct. But if the white supremacists didn't have guns, they wouldn't be able to shoot 13 people in a row. Right? That's just the reality of it. He wouldn't be able to do that. He might get one, but he ain't getting 13 in a row before he gets wrestled down. And these arguments are just endless. So we're going to touch on this, Mr. Storm, and then we're going to move on to our main story of the day.
What?
Families are grieving, and
just another Saturday in the US.
Unfortunately, it is just another Saturday in the US where a Black community is being ravaged by white supremacist ideals.
Black community, white community. Look, let's just be real. There's a whole bunch of crazy people over there that they give access to automatic weapons. In terms of the race aspect of this, I'm surprised that there haven't been more already.
Well, they've gone up. I mean, the cases of crimes that have been reported, of course, considering that that is notoriously underreported, and then on top of the underreporting is the police is underreporting and undertaking it seriously. You're still talking about 10,000 cases per year. And of course, there are about 40,000 deaths per year. So, but in terms of hate crimes, that's 10,000 per year. I mean, that's underreporting. So you could almost double that figure. That's a lot of hate crimes
Yeah,
that are
but
being perpetuated against
what I
predominantly
mean,
Asian and Black people.
yeah, what I mean is that I'm surprised there haven't been more mass killings that are racially motivated. I mean, when you think about the amount of bomb threats that synagogues and mosques get, the amount of people that create manifestos like this guy did. And I'm not going to give him the excuse of calling him a nut job
No,
because
he's
he's not
young.
crazy,
He's not
right?
crazy, but he's
But
been told.
the amount of people that create manifestos
Mm,
that are stopped before they can carry out
mm,
these acts. Look, the number over there is insane,
yeah, yeah.
you know. And I think it's made easier by a lot of statements coming out from the GOP over
Mm,
there,
mm,
because as they have become more violent in their rhetoric and whipping up their supporters in terms of overturning the elections, what they're essentially doing is geeing up people to use violence against people or decisions that they don't like. And you saw that come out or come to a head in January the 6th. But it doesn't mean that there aren't still people bubbling over with those sentiments.
yeah.
And let's be honest, their rhetoric really hasn't died down since January the 6th.
Mm,
Um, in some cases, you could probably say it's gotten worse and it's gotten more insidious. And the fact that they continue to perpetuate this myth that there's a stolen election and telling people that they're wrong and you need to fight for your rights. Well, your rights weren't denied, they weren't taken away. You still went to
mm.
the box, your vote was counted. You just didn't like the outcome. Um, yeah, I think it's, yeah, anyway, the less I say about the GOP, the better. And I think I need to just make a distinction for anyone who's watching from the US. I don't regard this as um, a Republican issue in
Yeah,
terms of Republican voter.
oh,
I regard this as an institutional
yeah,
problem with the GOP and the leadership
yeah.
and the messaging and the things that they've been saying. Um, I I think it's possible to be conservative and a balanced, reasonable human being.
Absolutely right.
But let's be real, there's many in the GOP that are not reasonable, that are not balanced, and that are dangerous.
Yeah. Very sadly, that, my friend, is true. And that unfortunately works across all religions, all countries, and resonates, I think, across the globe, sadly. Well, today's news story, I know Mrs. Storm's going to take us away on this one, but I really wanted to do this. So I've kind of hammered it home that I wanted to do this main story that we're doing today. But I want to do this story because I found it to be really infuriating. We have talked many times about capitalism, white supremacist capitalism, particularly the idea of this kind of system that it puts profit above people and has consistently showed itself not to be in the interest of people. We're living at a particular time in history where, of course, gas prices, you'll see that you're all paying a lot of the pumps for your gas, whether you're using petrol, diesel, whatever type of unleaded, whatever you're using, the prices are escalating. If you have a UPG, I think it's called, your price of gas is escalating. You will notice that throughout your fuel bills that they're going up. You will notice that the price of food, you're under pressure for those things. And it does seem that it's almost becoming more of a cartel because smaller companies are being priced out of the market. There have been a couple of companies that have closed both in the UK and Europe who've actually crashed out. And those larger companies are going back to consolidating and becoming bigger and bigger. And these problems of price hikes always. Now, interestingly, when I say that, the Netherlands decided to pause the tax on their diesel fuel tax to give us a break here because the fuel prices were just climbing and climbing and climbing. And in doing that, we saw a little reprieve that happened here. What's interesting about that, of course, is that for years, for decades, in fact, companies have been telling us that the majority of the price of diesel and, of fuel is tax. It's not us. We don't do that to you. It's not us that does that. The price hikes are because we are taxed so heavily at the pump. Lies. We all now realize it's lies because you're charging nearly €2+ euros for this, and there's a pause on the tax, so you're lying to us. Anyway, what I found interesting in this story is, so after the UN COP26, so you'll remember that last year, the Guardian newspaper, so publishing house in the UK, had decided to do an investigation because something didn't add up to them. Something was wrong in what was being said. It took all of COP26 effort to put fossil fuel onto the bill, and the only fossil fuel that was being talked about was coal. Gas and oil were not on the list. And so they decided to do a real investigation into what was happening. What they have uncovered is shocking. Oil and gas companies are planning scores of new projects that threaten to shatter the 1.5 degree climate goal that was in place. So if governments and firms continue the way they're going to cash in on the increases in price of fuel, they will basically blow it out of the water. So there are these carbon bombs, they're calling them, that will literally tip us over. So what companies are we talking about? ExxonMobil, Shell, BP and Chevron have made almost 2 trillion in profits in the past 3 decades. In doing that, the prices are continuing to go up so high that the BP's boss is actually describing, because the prices of diesel and petrol and fuel and gas, depending on your country, what you use, where it's come from, has climbed so high. BP's boss actually has described fuel as a cash machine. That's how he's described it. So while you're suffering, the bosses of these companies are cashing in. So during the actual COP26, what was focused on is China being the world's biggest polluter. Interestingly, these new developments, these 195 different gas oil projects that are being planned in majority US companies, UK companies, European companies, not where the majority of the effort of COP26 went into giving the energy to, which was China, which was the Middle East, which was Russia, which was India. I mean, that if you were listening while it went along, developing nations were screaming at the West, literally. The Barbados president got up and gave this amazing speech that while you as Western nations, US, UK, France, calling them all out, are there doing nothing and allowing these companies to dig oil to find new places, it is us, Barbados, small countries, small islands, developing nations around the world who are suffering the consequences of these actions. And because you think that these actions are not going to affect your country, you do nothing to stop them. And so this report goes on to say that in essence, the dozen biggest oil companies are on track to spend $103 million a day for the rest of the decade exploiting new oil fields and gas that cannot be burned if global heating is to be limited to well under 2 degrees centigrade. So if it's to be limited, what gets the most attention, of course, is the Middle East and Russia. But most of the actual new gas developments are in US, Canada, Australia, among the biggest ones that are doing this and have the biggest expansion plans and the highest number of carbon bombs that will be released. These things will not be burned. They will not be burned off. About 60% of these projects have already started pumping. They're already, because it's a cash cow. What does he say? It's a cash machine, because they're just printing their money basically by holding us over, saying that there's a shortage, when what they do is bottleneck the supply in order to make it appear as if there is a shortage. So we have to pay higher prices. This whole system, to me, it made me quite passionate because it hits on so many issues. So many issues. But the one that it hits on that grates me the most is that there are big companies who are continuing to benefit off the backs of poor people in the entire globe is suffering under this, and they are continuing to do it because they are left unchecked. No one is doing anything to stop it. There is no government that's standing up to it. There is no idea of renationalizing some of these programs to stop this behavior. There is nothing being done to stop these companies from exploiting the people, charging through the nose and using us like we're cash machines. Mr. Storm, please help me out.
With what? You pretty much said it all. What exactly did you want me to cover?
Well, I know you have a good way of saying it. I'm just kind of just like set off my, my vex nest.
Yes, okay. I do have good ways of saying things, but I think the best way to put this is in the words of BP's chief financial officer from February of this year. And his words are, I quote, "We're getting more cash than we know what to do with," end quote. So, you see all these price rises that are going on? It's not necessary because they're getting more cash than they know what to do with. Right? So we can talk about the morality, or the immorality rather, of what they're doing in terms of um, price increases. We can talk about the failure of governments. Right. Okay. So here's the first thing. COP26 focused mainly and chiefly on coal fuel. Right. Now, the problem with that is that 60% of carbon emissions, CO2, carbon dioxide emissions, come from oil and gas, right? So coal is not the biggest contributor to CO2 emissions. Here's the thing, though: the biggest users of coal are China and India. So you have to understand that this is a politically motivated move because China is a superpower and India is up and coming as the next superpower, right? So these are moves that are designed in an attempt to hamstring their economies and stop their growth on the global scale, or sorry, on the global map. So I think we need to be mindful of those things. Now, is it good that coal is being cut, or that you want to cut coal emissions? Absolutely. Absolutely. But the problem is the third and fourth biggest users of coal are what? Are who?
US?
Number 3. Number 4?
UK?
Europe.
Oh, Europe as a whole. Yeah, I was like, that doesn't quite make sense. It has to be slightly bigger. EU as a block.
Right? The EU. So they're still heavily reliant on coal. They have no way, or they do not have the infrastructure for renewable sources of
Hmm.
fuel to make up the drop in coal if they were to eradicate coal. They do not have the infrastructure or investment in place to account for if they wish to get rid of oil and gas as fuel supplies. So you have to understand this is nothing but smoke up your pipe, right? And there's a real danger in what's happening because scientists have, well, initially in 2015, what they said was we need to keep global warming under 2 degrees Celsius,
Mm.
right? And in order to do that, half of the oil, a third of the gas, and 80% of the coal that is currently, or in 2015, that was currently unexploited, had to remain unexploited,
Unexploited.
right?
And are they leaving it unexploited?
No, but
No.
subsequently, as knowledge and understanding of global warming has increased, what they have discovered is actually in order to stop the havoc on the environment, droughts, freak weather, all of these things, global warming had to be kept under 1.5 degrees Celsius, which means even more of those unexploited materials had to remain unexploited. Since then, these larger oil companies have committed themselves to billions, billions of dollars in infrastructure for existing and new projects, right?
103 million per day.
No, 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 no. You have that wrong. It's actually just under 400 million a day.
Oh,
But
no.
103 million
Is on the new
is
ones.
going, is going to the new ones,
Yeah.
right? So you have to understand they have no intention of phasing out the current projects that they have. They're currently continuing to maintain that infrastructure at, nearly 300 million a day.
Do you know what's really sad is that, in the as you're sitting there saying that, and I'm like, but to whom are you selling this stuff to? Because we've been told that we had to go electric by set dates. So what you're saying is that you're expecting us to use this within these time frames, and then you're going
No,
to charge us through the nose for this
no,
stuff.
no, 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 no. There's no intention of going electric by a certain date. Make no mistake about that. No country in the world has the infrastructure to achieve that. And they're not investing enough within that infrastructure to achieve that. Right. And here's the reality: if these oil companies actually thought that that was a possibility, they would be investing that 400 million a day into renewable fuel sources.
Oh,
Right?
hey, ha
And
ha.
and even if they didn't invest a full 400 million, that 103 million a day that they collectively spend on finding new sources of oil and gas, why would you not invest that into renewable energy infrastructure? Because you have no intention and they know it's not a realistic target. Um,
They weren't held to account at all.
right.
You never heard about this at COP26. I mean, you know, arguably people say, well, Tabitha, that's because you read and listen to mainstream newspapers and things like that. But, the young activists and the activists that were there were talking about these things.
Mm.
Absolutely. I understand that there were activists talking about these things. But guess who wasn't talking about these things? No governments, no mainstream media. Nobody was talking about this. In fact, this investigation I found to be even a surprise. It's like, oh, a
Right,
mainstream paper decided to do an investigation on this. Wow.
right. So ExxonMobil and Gazprom
Mm-hmm.
over the next 7 years are exploring projects that are projected to produce 192 billion barrels of oil and liquid gas, right? So let's put this into
So tell us again
pollution.
why we have to be paying so much if you can find that much. It's literally like a cash machine.
Listen, that's only two companies, right? But in terms of pollution, that is the equivalent to a decade of China's current CO2 emissions, right? So that equates to 73 billion tons of CO2. Okay. Now, with these new uh, oil and gas fields, what happens is they also, the drilling and extraction of these resources also releases methane gas. So the true figure, right? Oh, and methane gas traps about 86 times more heat in the atmosphere than CO2. Okay. So the equivalent or the more accurate figure of CO2 that will be released from it from just these two companies and their projects over the next 7 years is actually closer to 97 billion tons of CO2 in the atmosphere. All right.
Mental.
Now, these projects that they're talking about involve fracking and ultra deep uh, offshore drilling. And these are actually really, if you thought that traditional methods
Mm.
of extracting these resources were hazardous, you ain't seen nothing yet. The increased risk of oil spills is insane with
Yeah.
these methods of
Destruction of
extraction.
wildlife, etc.
You know, you're talking about drilling down into water tables and all sorts of things. So there are real problems, and with the expansion, just to show how unserious governments are about this problem. Uh, Between January the 20th, 2021 to August the 1st, the US government issued over 2,400 drilling permits for federal land.
Ooh.
Now,
Whew.
admittedly, that number has dropped drastically. So only 95 were issued in January of this year, right? But what happens is the US government sells leases on the land to these oil companies, and the oil companies will just sit on the land, right? And then when they want to drill it, then they apply for a permit to drill. Okay. But the US government has just handed out a whole bunch of them. If you were serious about reducing, right? If you were serious about reducing um, CO2 emissions, you'd just be like, well, we're not giving more leases and we're not giving more permits. We're done with this,
Yeah.
right? Invest in renewable infrastructure. Um, but also, I think let's not just talk about the US, let's talk about the UK. Um, the UK have plans for Mozambique. And what they've done is they have committed over 1 billion of taxpayer money and invested over 1 billion of taxpayer money into the infrastructure and planning of an offshore drill site and a factory to refine liquid gas. Right now, what is happening is that you now have the larger oil companies sensing profit, so they're coming sniffing around. But I think what you're seeing are the immediate effects that these policies have on the poor majority peoples of the world, because subsistence farmers are being kicked off their land, fishermen are being kicked out of their homes, just to make way for these projects. But what's also being missed in this conversation is that the voices of indigenous peoples in the US are ignored. The voices of indigenous peoples in Australia are ignored. The voices of indigenous people in Canada are ignored. All over the world, these voices are being ignored.
Yeah.
Treaties are being disregarded and ripped up.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And then you hear governments say, "But trust us." Well, why should I trust you? If you're ignoring the treaties that you already made,
Yeah.
why should I enter into any new agreements with you?
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, but also with global warming, the people that bear the brunt of the impact of global warming are poor people from the world majority areas.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
When temperature rises come and droughts come, well, who gets hit first? Who gets hit hardest? Um, and then what you find is, because of the structure of the economic system, the global economic system, a lot of these countries actually don't own the land or the resources themselves. France is a terrible one for this. The UK still is a terrible one for this. And in fact, we never did the tea story that I wanted to talk about. Kenya, the Kenyan story.
No, we didn't. Yes, I have it. Said I'll do it next week. Yeah.
Um, but they don't own the land, they don't own the resources. The system was
It's not
designed,
even in their countries sometimes.
right, to cut them out of it. And so when you see the shortages of goods come, well, guess what? The countries that are actually producing it, it gets taken and exported into Western, read white countries,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
right? So you're
Mm-hmm.
literally taking the things that the people there need for yourselves. You're leaving them to starve.
Yep.
So yeah, there's a lot of issues with that. What else is there to talk about in regards to this? Um, what did I say?
Well, I think one thing we haven't mentioned so far is, of course, that the Western media outlets, particularly, and governments have talked about the fact that we're really sorry that you're experiencing these higher prices at the pumps and that these prices are increasing. But
Right,
the war has been depleted. Russia's the war. And the truth is very frighteningly different. The war doesn't seem to have as much to do with it as they see the public or the opportunity to take advantage of the situation to charge higher prices and to force our hands at the pumps while they are literally making trillions of dollars in profit. And
right.
I say dollars because that again is a scam. Like, it always has to be done in dollars.
The petrodollar.
We're not.
The petrodollar literally holds up the U.S. economy these days. But that's a whole different story. Um, right. So here's the thing about the war in Ukraine. It's being used as a smokescreen to price gouge, because, as we've just said, or as I quoted earlier, the BP CFO said, "Look, we're making so much cash, we don't even know what to do with it." So the prices don't have to be as high as they are, and they'd still be making a profit, right? But I think one of the things that needs to be pointed out is that you hear governments around the world talk about, especially in Europe, we need to wean ourselves off the dependence of Russian gas and oil,
Yeah. Yeah.
except Europe's uh, reserves of oil and gas are practically depleted. So you don't have much yourself to producing that. Um, you're not investing, or you haven't committed to invest in renewable energy sources, with this problem. But I think also one of the things to be noted is that as the war has allowed these fuel companies to push their prices higher, it has only incentivized them to invest more
Mhm.
in projects regarding the exploitation of gas and oil
Yeah,
because
because
of
one plus one equals do it again, right? So the
it's
fact that
become
we
more,
need to wean ourselves off of Russian oil means we need to find our own. The fact that we're making so much money means we need to make more money. One
right.
plus one equals we're going to keep doing it.
But here's the thing. I think you're mixing the government's position versus the company's position. So the companies are looking at this saying, well, it's been profitable for us.
Mhm.
Um, so what we're going to do is we're going to commit more for future projects.
Yes.
Right? Governments haven't said no to this. Now they could easily say no to this by saying we're not giving permits for drilling.
No, but the narrative they're telling is we're not saying no to this because we need to wean ourselves off of Russian gas. We need to but so in order to do that, we need to say yes to this, which gives higher profits. But who owns these companies? Who has shares in these companies? Oh, the same governments.
Yes, the same politicians that run the governments. But what I'm talking about is in relation to their stance on commitments to reduce CO2 emissions,
Mm,
right?
mm,
So you have the government's position versus the company's position.
mm,
So the companies are now committing more to invest in oil and gas. So the war in Ukraine is actually having the opposite effect that politicians are saying this is what we're going to do, because they've talked about saying, well, we're going to wean ourselves off, so we need more renewable sources, except that the fuel companies aren't committed to
mhm,
investigating how to produce more renewable sources
mhm,
of energy.
mhm,
So, and then we have to deal with the fact that the price that we're paying is being artificially inflated,
mhm.
right? So OPEC, oil producing something or countries, what they do is they get together and they say, okay, we're only going to produce this amount of barrels of oil. And they use that to inflate the price of oil. And occasionally, countries, governments will say, look, when the people get too angry, no, we need you to produce more. And then what you'll see is that they'll say, okay, well, we'll produce, a couple of 100,000 barrels or a million barrels more. Um, but they never bring the price low. They produce enough so that the price might stay steady, but not enough to drop the
Not
price.
drop back down to what it was 2 years ago.
And I think we need
Please.
to recognize, look, we don't want them to produce more, but they are fully capable of producing more to deflate the price of the fuel and to bring
Mhm,
down the cost of living so that people can survive.
mhm.
And, we're talking about the fact that people are turning off in the UK are turning off their fuel supplies.
Yeah.
They can no longer afford to keep it on. So they're living in cold homes, you know, they can't afford to heat the homes. The problem is that they
The
can't
water.
afford the electricity either, which
Nope.
means they can't afford to run their fridge. So if you can't
Yep.
afford to run the fridge, where are you storing your food?
You know,
Now, here's the reality. We know that some poor people in the US
don't
don't
even own a
understand that
fridge.
problem because they don't own a fridge.
That to this day has rocked my world.
But a fridge in Europe is pretty much considered an essential piece of apparatus.
A
right?
fridge in any country is an essential piece of apparatus. The fact that the US claims to be the country with the big giant fridges, and there are people in your country that do not own a fridge, is to me shocking. Shocking.
Yeah.
This is what
Now,
you buy. You move into a house, you buy a washing machine, you buy a fridge. This is what you buy. These are the two staple items that get cooker, washing machine, fridge.
the staple, but
Luxury is a dryer. Luxury might be considered a dishwasher, but guess what is not a luxury? Fridge.
no, fridges are considered essential. So there's that to bear in mind. Now, I'm mindful of the time. We've gone
Yes.
over an hour. Now, here's the thing. I just want to bring out a problem that I see with how governments are going about getting rid, or the talk that they give of getting rid of fossil fuels, right? One, it's not a real commitment. Okay. It's not a realistic goal in the way that you've done it because there's a lack of investment in the infrastructure. But let's
Mhm.
assume that it was possible. Let's assume that you were going to do it. The
Let's assume
problem,
you were serious.
yes, let's assume you were serious, right? The problem is that there is no plan to deal with the electric companies now
No.
because the electric companies will simply replace
Gas company.
the oil and gas companies, and they will price gouge their customers. But what would happen is that it is perhaps even worse when the electric companies do it. Because if I can't afford to pay the price for oil and gas, I can get on a bicycle and ride somewhere. I can walk there, right?
Mhm.
But if I can't afford to pay for electricity now, that's a whole different matter because the fridge we were talking about becomes redundant, right? If electricity is the main source of fuel, then of course running a
Yeah.
car goes out the window.
Mhm.
Lights go out the window. But more importantly, things like your cell phone go out the window. And why do I say more importantly? Because whenever you try to do anything these days, they require a cell phone number, right?
Your
If you
banking is
want
done on an app.
right, your banking is done on an app, although the US actually does lag behind, so some of people might not quite understand that concept.
True.
Um,
Us
right?
Europeans will
Listen,
diminish
listen,
and cry. You cut off our telephones and we're literally you can't bank. Some of us can't shop for food. We can't apply for jobs. We cannot um you can't even deal with the government. You can't replace a passport. You can't I mean, you just completely lose your entire identity because you don't have a phone.
right? So that's your cell phone gone. But now we need to talk about the importance of the internet because once your electricity goes, you don't have access to the internet now, right? And the internet is a fundamental tool in the education of children these days, right? So people that are from disadvantaged backgrounds are only going to become further disadvantaged.
Mhm, mhm, mhm.
It is my belief that in order to deal with these problems, and if you're serious about moving to renewable forms of energy, then it is necessary to reprivatize, or if you don't, isn't doesn't already exist, to sorry, not reprivatize, to nationalize or renationalize your electricity companies.
Yeah.
That is the only way to avoid the current exploitation that people face at the hands of oil and gas companies,
Yeah.
right? And I think that is one of the problems with moving to renewable sources that isn't addressed.
Mm,
I
mm,
have not heard anyone else speak of this problem.
mm,
Me, I see it as a massive, massive, massive
mm.
problem and barrier
Yeah.
towards removal, towards moving towards renewable sources of energy.
Yeah.
And I know there's going to be capitalists out there that are going to be up in arms about the idea of nationalizing the energy companies, but it's my personal belief that anything that is considered essential to the life of a populace should be nationalized. And if we move to renewable sources, then electricity becomes an
More
essential.
than essential. Yeah. You know, normally when we do this, I know we're wrapping up now. So normally when we do this, I have a really rousing speech at the end where we can encourage you to do something about an issue. Where I've got something that I could say, you know, go to your politicians, you know, hold your police community in your area accountable, talk to people, educate yourself about a topic, and do something. I have to admit that when I was looking at this story, and then you look at the depth and breadth that we know about capitalism, etc., it really did feel like out of my hands. Like I really just genuinely didn't have a rousing speech at the end, other than to say, if you have ideas about what we can do collectively to change this situation where companies are really putting profit before people, before the environment, before absolutely everything, we need to come up with a solution. Rightly said, Storm here is talking about the fact that, you know, renationalizing electric, you know, any company that deals with electric is a necessity. How do we go about that? Because I think in the end, we are heading towards an actual catastrophe for many families and many people. And for a lot of people, they look down on poor families. But these are our essential workers. You know this. We've just done 2 years of a pandemic where our lowest paid workers have been fighting for their lives, working their tushies off, doing everything they can, and yet still governments are not supporting our lowest people. And we pay taxes for this, right? I pay taxes. We all pay taxes to help the fact that our system should work better, and should the lowest, the poorest, the neediest amongst us will be taken care of. If this isn't working, the system ain't working, we need to do something. The fact that companies can be talking about trillions in profit, billions is a number that is completely mind-boggling, let alone trillions in profit. What is profit? Profit isn't a thing. It's actually not a thing. I don't know why people keep like, you have to make a profit. If you've paid all your bills, you've paid all your people, what exactly do we need profit for? You could be investing that in renewable energy projects. You could be investing that in the people that are suffering. You could take down the prices that you're price gouging us with, so that you don't actually, because you don't need profit. What are you talking about? I don't have any rousing speech to tell you to go do something other than to say, please help a sister out. Put in the comments what you think we can do. If there's something, support your indigenous populations and fight side by side with them against these governments and companies. Like, I don't know. It's tough. It feels like an insurmountable problem.
Yeah. Look, you know, when they say people that go to live off the grid are a bit,
Woohoo.
yeah. The more you see capitalism and or it's the current form of capitalism, the more you think actually maybe not going to live off the grid is the real crazy position to hold. Um,
Yeah, it's really worrying. Well, you know, the dark side is here to educate you, to bring these issues to the forefront, to open your eyes to the fact that there is a different way of looking at these issues, particularly with COP26. We spoke about this last year when it was on. And I hadn't really considered the finer details of some of the points, especially as it relates to oil and gas. I kind of made some assumptions, which was maybe naive of me at the time. But we're here to do these things because I think it's important. We think it's important that you understand the systems within which we work, the way that they're set up to profit only a very small minority of people within European context, because they are built off the back of white capitalistic supremacist ideas. And those ideas don't support human life, really.
Look, this is how I measure most things in the world these days. I look at what rich white people are doing and I go, why is that happening? So when it came to the vaccine, you know my stance on that. I weren't taking that till I saw rich white people taking it.
That's true.
Right? Because I'm like, yo, they know what's going on, right? All that, you know, behind the doors trading and all the conversations. Look, when rich white people start doing it, they'll do it. Here's my question: why so many rich white people trying to get to space? Because they know what the hell is going on down there,
Woo! Well,
right?
now let's save Earth,
So
shall we?
all I'm gonna say to people is, look, if they all trying to get off of this planet, then you know they know this place is jacked up or is gonna be jacked up real soon. And they have the resources to escape the consequences of their
Your
actions.
actions. Yeah.
And the only way to prevent it is if we actually start to vote for people that will do what we ask of them.
And that won't be your mainstream leaders, that's for sure. Well, this is the dark side. We are so glad you're with us. Please continue to like, comment, share our stuff. We will see you every Sunday at 9 p.m. I've been Tabitha Purple. This is The Coming Storm. Have a wonderful evening. Peace. Nothing from you? No?
Okay. Well, I done.
Bye-bye, folks.